director of the research for the institute. Also, he's one of the leads for the Inclusiveness Index Initiative, Fair Housing Policy Opportunity Mapping project that anchor within the equity matrix. But also Stephen have a general focus and wide focus on mechanism of intergroup inequality, structural racism, and the design of effective equity intervention as permitted by the law. Stephen also author and co-author many of the Institute publication, but in particular, he's developed and co-led some of the amicus briefs of the Institute that submitted to the Supreme Court, particularly the case of Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs versus the Inclusive Communities Project, and also Fisher versus Texas amicus brief and others. Stephen have a wide range of interest and expertise, particularly around American democracy and politics, but also the law and the way in which civil rights and constitutional law impacted our societies. Before I'll let you take it, Stephen, Nilo, do we have Stephen as a co-host so he can upload his?
You should be able to screen share already, but I'll make him co-host as well, just in case.
Okay, just a very quick clearinghouse. Stephen will talk for about, I don't know, up to 45 minutes. And after that, we will open it for a conversation and Q&A. We have time, reserved time till 2:30, but we don't have to consume all the time. So if you finish before that, that's totally fine. Stephen, welcome, and take it from here.
Thank you so much, Sadiq. It's wonderful to, I feel like I've seen you twice, maybe 3 or 4 times since this pandemic began. So it's really nice to see you and everyone else. It's my privilege to be with you, not your privilege to have me. Although I cringe when people read my bio. So maybe next time don't do that. I'm excited to speak with you all, and you know, it's been a strange summer for all the fellows, and on the one hand I feel really awful for you all because you know the summer fellowship is such a fantastic experience, which I think it is this summer as well. But part of that experience is getting together and you know getting in those conversations and learning about each other's work. And I think there are unfortunately too few opportunities to do that. So I would really love, I have some slides, but I'd really love to try and get you all engaged in a conversation during this time. And you know, also one of the downsides is that the staff gets to mingle more with the fellowship when it's all in person and we're all stuffed onto the 3rd and 4th floors of Stevens Hall. And I think I've only met maybe at the 2 of you that I've been working with. So it's going to be a pleasure to get to chat with you this afternoon, those of you I haven't met. Also, just for whatever reason, I'm a little on the tired side, so my synapses are firing a little bit more slowly. So just bear with me if I need to repeat something or catch myself. Just forgive me for that. I found myself rereading sentences this morning. So I may beg your patience here. All right, I'm going to switch into screen share mode right now. And I have an aversion to Zoom, which means that I don't use the Zoom program. I use Zoom through a web browser. Okay. So hopefully it has all the same bells and whistles. Let me go to, before I proceed, can I just get confirmation that you all can see this?
That's good.
Just from anyone?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so I named this a primer, but it's not really great. Thank you. It's not really a primer. I'm going to call this more provocation than primer, and hopefully it will trigger some interesting
discussion. We lost it again, so I'm not sure.
Oh, really?
Screen share, yeah.
Okay, let me go back. I think I pressed stop sharing instead of hide, so my mistake.
Okay.
Just an example of what I was talking about earlier. All right,
Okay.
are we
Great.
good?
Good now.
So I titled this a primer, but it's more a provocation. It'll be a series of provocations than a primer. That doesn't mean that it's not, my beliefs or my understanding or my best um, research-based empirical understanding of how othering occurs and how we might conceptualize belonging. But I do think there are some challenging edges to what I'm about to present. Um, can I just ask, so I just, before we begin, I had asked Sadiq to circulate a few pre-readings. One of the readings was, I believe, assigned at the beginning of the summer, which was the problem of othering piece that we wrote for the journal. Um, did everyone, is everyone here familiar with that piece?
Yes.
You know what I could do is I could do that. I don't have the chat open at the moment because I can't have the chat in the slide deck, but okay. One thing I could do for engagement is I could do that, ask a question and have you click raise hands. Um, one of the things I just want to note about that article is that the article was written, we started writing it in 2013 when the Institute was just getting its sea legs. We opened in 2012. And the focus in the article is called The Problem of Othering Towards Belonging. And if you read it, it's broken out roughly into 50% on othering and 50% on belonging. But if you read it closely, it's really all about othering, right? Even the second part of the article, which says it's about belonging, is really about what belonging is not. And that really reflects the work of the Institute, our research, our thinking, our analysis from 2012 to 2016. And I would say in the last 3 years, we've really pivoted. We've made a sharp turn. So whereas before it was, 80-20 othering belonging, now it's actually, I think, something close to more 70% belonging, 30% othering, if not 80-20 in the other direction. And unfortunately, my slide deck here will recapitulate the problem. I think it's tilted towards othering on balance, but I just wanted to flag that the center of energy for us is really more around belonging than othering at the moment. And I think the article reflects that. So that's why I had Sadiq send around a few other materials, in particular, our first artist in residence. I don't know if we were able to get a copy of that book, but that booklet is a phenomenal exegesis on belonging, an investigation of belonging in the Bay Area, in which she interviewed hundreds of artists, community organizers, residents, researchers, trying to figure out what is belonging, and then develop this beautiful map of where belonging is. So we'll come back to that later, but I just wanted to flag that. So what do these three stories have in common? Probably the most horrifying genocide of the last 5 years has been the genocide against the Rohingya in Western Myanmar, where hundreds of thousands, about 1 million ethnic minority Rohingya were driven from the villages in Western Myanmar across this narrow strait into Bangladesh. And this slide's a little bit old, but pretty much the consensus is now this is either ethnic cleansing or a genocide, attempted genocide. I think probably many people are, if you haven't heard of the Rohingya, it's gotten a decent amount of American press, but it's not foremost in the American press. Another example of an ethnic attack was, so the Kurds are an ethnic minority, a Muslim ethnic minority in the Middle East that have large populations in Syria, in Iraq, in Turkey, and Turkey has always had this very, I'll just say it best, ambivalent relationship with the Kurds, and in 2015, under Erdogan, who's the head of Turkey, began instituting curfews on Kurdish towns in Turkey, and then eventually has been waging these military campaigns where they're launching missiles into Kurdish communities, trying to drive the Kurds into Syria and northern Iraq. And worse has happened since. And then in 2016, China began a massive program of detention and concentration camps of ethnic Uyghurs in this northwestern province in China. And this came out in the news recently because of John Bolton's book, where he said that Trump had a conversation with Xi Jinping that he thought it was fine, as a fine idea, to put people in. And Vice News had a really incredible hidden camera story video, and maybe I should have sent this around, about 15-minute video where they got a hidden camera into Xinjiang. I don't know how to pronounce this province, even though I've been taking Mandarin during the quarantine. But it really is, far beyond a surveillance state. There are re-education centers. So the question is, what do these stories have in common? Anyone? Don't be shy.
I mean, one thing I think we can identify from all of these cases is that there's a population that is becoming defined and along lines of ethnicity, for example, in these examples, and made subordinate through state and extra legal measures.
Right. Anyone else? That's great. One other response?
Of state-sanctioned violence and the fact that these are kind of systemic forces that are used against these groups of people?
Yeah. So I think both those answers are correct. Another frame is that in each case you have a discrete and somewhat insular minority group that is either ethnically and or religiously defined, and that helps explain their discreteness, that is subjected to state-sanctioned or the state violence, or the state has stood by while private violence has occurred. So in the case of Rohingya, the report suggests that the state trained local private groups, and there was a kind of interaction between private and state behavior there. But in each case, you have a discrete and insular group, and in each of these cases, it happens to be a minority in the larger state, not necessarily in the provinces in which, or the neighborhoods or communities or municipalities in which they occur. That's my dog in the background, just to ignore my dog stretching. And so in each case, you have these discrete groups that are basically, and I didn't get into this, but they were marginalized to begin with. And their marginalization is exacerbated by various forms of violence or control. And so what's interesting is you can look at almost any place in the world, almost any place, and you can find marginalized groups in every country. And so, in the Problem of Othering article, the reason we open with these stories, and the Chinese Uyghur story is new here, was because we wanted folks to enter into a conversation around othering that began with, let's call it, not the usual suspects. That is, not with the forms of marginality that are most familiar to Americans, which are, the deepest social cleavage probably in the United States, of course, is race. But there are many forms of marginality, right, around sexual orientation, around disability and ability, around religion, especially after 9/11, religion becomes incredibly salient, but has long been. And so we have different forms of marginalization. But the point of these stories is to show that in different contexts, different forms of marginality are salient, and also to suggest that, for example, many of these groups, as you point out, are ethnic groups, but they're also religious groups, and so you can have multiple identities overlay, right? And so when you have an ethnic or racial identity that overlays and correlates with a religious identity, which overlays and correlates with a set of linguistic and cultural practices, which overlays with a set of ethnic identities, then the capacity for othering becomes incredibly intense because those identities not reinforce each other and reinforce the potential for marginalization, or what we call othering. So the short answer is that group-based identities are central to each of these conflicts, but in complicated ways. So it's not just one identity, but often the overlay of identities. And that this happens across the world, right? This is not just in the United States, not just in the West or the global North, but everywhere is the potential for this. And that's kind of what we talk about by othering. And so there's this famous phrase from W.B. Du Bois in his book, just at the turn of the 20th century, called "The Souls of Black Folk," where he says, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And so we riffed on this. You know, I started putting this slide in this phrase in John's talks, that the problem of othering is the problem of the 21st century, meaning that across the world there are these broad social cleavages that cross nation state boundaries, that cross continents and geographies. So one very salient cleavage is around a Muslim identity. So if whether you're looking at India in Assam province, or the Rohingya, who are predominantly Muslim, or in the United States, or in parts of Europe, this is a social cleavage. This is an identity, also a belief system that becomes salient and a basically a basis on which marginalization can occur. So we define othering. We came up with this. We looked at different definitions. This is the one that I worked on with John. A set of dynamics, processes, and structures that engender marginality and persistent inequality across any of the full range of human differences based on group identity. So there's a lot of components to this. But the point is, it's not just discrimination. It's not just norms or culture. It's structures, processes, and dynamics, and that it's those that engender marginality or persistent inequality across any of the full range of human differences based on group identities. So have any of you heard of the IAT? Let me go back to video so I can see folks. Have any of you heard of the IAT? You know what that is?
Yes.
You want to share what you know of the IAT? I think that was Lindsay.
Sure. So that IAT, if we're talking about the same thing, is the implicit association task. Is that the one you're referring to?
Yes.
And the implicit association task is essentially trying to get at the idea of exploring people's unconscious biases by having usually faces some image of a subject and having participants very quickly either associate them with, participants can choose between negative or positive words. And a lot of times the outcome or the measure is about how quickly you're able to accurately associate things. And then for the ones that don't have an accuracy part, also how many times you make errors and things like that.
Yes, that's great. That's a great synopsis on the spot. So the implicit association test was a test that was devised by Mahzarin Banaji and Anthony Grunwald at Harvard and the University of Washington. And the idea behind it was that all humans have unconscious associations, meaning that in our mind, in order to make sense of the world, we have basically categories that come very close to stereotyping. And when we talk about stereotypes, we assume that stereotypes are always a negative, but the social science, and specifically social psychology, suggests that it's actually not possible to function in the world without categorizations. That is to say, if you were to look at a spoon, every spoon that you see is probably somewhat different, and yet we can recognize it as a spoon. If we didn't have that capacity, we wouldn't have the ability to survive as a species. And so IAT suggests that not only does that happen with objects, but it happens with social categories. And so I'm going to screen share and show you the IAT website. This is so you can go in and take these tests, Project Implicit, and they have just a huge list of tests here, right? You can take one on sexuality, you can take one on gender, on religion, disability, but the most famous is race, the skin tone test. And basically what it does is it gives you a series of choices. So it'll have a word that either has a positive or negative valence, and it wants you to make click, you know, light skin or dark skin. And it's not testing what you click, it's testing the speed with which you click it. So I'll give you an example. Suppose I were to show you an image of a butterfly and the word ugly. There would be a moment of cognitive dissonance at an unconscious level. It might just be a half second. Or an image of a tarantula and the word beautiful. The word beautiful with a beautiful butterfly is going to match more quickly than that between, you know, ugly or terrifying, you know, with the butterfly. And vice versa, ugly and terrifying with the tarantula will match more quickly than with the butterfly. And so that's what this tests. And so they've had literally millions of people take these tests, and they find pretty consistent unconscious associations across time and space. Now, what's important about these tests is that the strength of the association actually changed from context to context, right? So in the American context, race is a very salient, because of salient social cleavage, it's going to show up more profoundly in the IAT. And they found that, you know, even all groups take these tests have moderate to high levels of anti-Black unconscious bias, for example. So even African Americans register these unconscious biases, and that's true for all groups. Now, it's not true for every person within those groups, but on average, we register these unconscious biases. But the point I'm making is that in different contexts, different group associations will be salient. So if you're in a context where there is, let's say it's racially homogeneous, then the race IAT isn't what matters. It might be, you know, the religion IAT or a gender IAT, right? And so in different contexts, in different parts of the world, different unconscious biases will be salient. And you can use that to identify which groups are more marginalized, at least in the unconscious level. Let me just get a little bit further, and then I'll open up to some conversations around. I'm going to go back to my slide deck here. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to skip that slide. So one of the challenges is that all across the world, we see ethno-nationalistic movements rising. They're growing in power and strength. And it's not, there's a lot and you can find in Europe, right? In Hungary, in Poland, in, you know, and then in the United States with Trump, in, you know, in all of Europe, but it's not just in Europe. It's in places like the Philippines and in India with Modi, that and in all other places besides. I mean, Bolsonaro in Brazil. And what I want to suggest, here's one of my provocations. One of my provocations, and I'm speaking not just to the fellows, but also to my colleagues here, that I want to suggest, is that the fundamental problem in the world right now is between people who want to build communities around a single primary salient identity and those who want pluralistic, inclusive societies where all can belong and no group is dominant. And so I had this really interesting conversation. We have, every year we host, I don't know if it'll happen this year, but we're supposed to host the Atlantic Fellows Program, which is a leadership development program focused on challenging and disestablishing anti-Black racism. And I think that cohort really struggles with this in particular, because one of the responses to othering is a kind of a tortoise response, right? And this goes, which is to kind of, which John, and I think he might have spoken with you about this, calls breaking, which is if we're being discriminated against, if we are being a target of either state sanction, like police violence, then one response is to pull back and become, you know, from that. And so we see that happen all over the world, right? And one challenge is, you know, so the challenge is how do we build inclusive, more than inclusive, societies where people belong and no group is dominant? And I think, this is not a new challenge. This is a challenge almost every generation has struggled with. And I'll talk more about that later, but I want to sit with that provocation. Let me just go through a few more slides. So we've gotten pretty deep in our analysis of the mechanisms of othering. I'm gonna blitz through these. Most obvious mechanism of othering is violence, and there's extreme forms of violence like genocide or murder, and there's episodic forms of violence. So, for example, when African American families would move into white neighborhoods in the North, you know, not just in like the 1950s and 60s, but even in the 80s, 90s, and aughts, there was even a case, I think, in the 1990s about cross burning for a family who moved into a white neighborhood in the North. So those are examples of violence. Lots of examples of violence against transgender women, especially Black transgender women. In the last couple of years, we wrote a whole segment about this in our inclusiveness index. Violence is a kind of leading indicator of othering, because when you have a frequent incidence of violence against a marginalized group, that suggests, against a particular group, it suggests that that group is marginalized. Discrimination, of course, is another expression of othering, but it's not a mechanism of othering, because obviously, if a group is discriminated against, it engenders their marginality on a range of indicators. But it's not just whether a group is discriminated against, it's also whether there are protections against discrimination and whether those protections are enforced. So in a society where discrimination is not permitted but still frequent, but the anti-discrimination laws are enforced, there is a different message being sent than a society where discrimination is not illegal. So for example, in the United States, we have federal laws that prohibit discrimination on the basis of race and gender and national origin, rather sex, but we don't have federal protections, at least until last Monday, on the basis of sexual orientation. And the 1964 Civil Rights Act was just recently interpreted to extend to sexual orientation and to protect transgender persons. Okay, a third mechanism is segregation, and I want to spend a second on this. This is a dot map of the Bay Area. And it's not technically a segregation map, it's a racial composition map. But you can see from this map that the Bay Area is very segregated, right? I mean, you have clearly definable neighborhoods throughout the Bay Area. West Oakland, lots of African American families. East Oakland, lots of Latinx families. Clusters of Asian families in Chinatown and Western San Francisco. African Americans in Bayview, Hunters Point. It's just clearly this is, even though in a diverse place you can have lots of segregation. I sent this to some of my colleagues yesterday. This is a kind of a dot map, but it's actually not families, it's of neighborhoods. This is more of a trick question, but can any of you guess where this map is? It's basically two groups, so it's not a very, this isn't a kind of a multiracial or multi-ethnic context, but does anyone recognize this little piece of land? Or want to take a guess where it is?
It could be Seattle, maybe?
Oh, it does kind of look like Seattle. Interesting guess. See, the one reason this wouldn't be Seattle is because Seattle has a lot of, it has a non-trivial African American population, but Seattle is, I think, more diverse than this place. In the sense, this is pretty much just two groups in this map. One more?
Contra Costa?
No, Contra Costa is much more diverse as well. One more. One more guess? I'll give you a hint. This is not in the United States. Okay, I'll stop messing with you guys, you all. This is actually Northern Ireland. And the green group is I believe Catholics, and the blue group are Protestants. So Northern Ireland has a very complex history going back, many, many years. But Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. And had going back to the Troubles. But part of what I wanted to show you is that segregation is a ubiquitous phenomenon, right? It's not just racial segregation, this is religious segregation. And the effects of segregation isn't just about segregating people into different neighborhoods, it's actually about segregating them from resources. And so what I pulled this is that the blue dots actually have longer life expectancy than the green dots. The green men, meaning the Catholic men, lived 74.4 years life expectancy compared to 81.7 years for the blue men, and not quite as severe disparity between Catholic and Protestant women. We found in our series on racial segregation in the Bay that life expectancy was more than 5 years greater in white neighborhoods than in highly segregated Black or Latinx neighborhoods. And so the point is that, you can look at the former Yugoslavia, the war in Kosovo, and what they've done in Kosovo, and it is basically the Catholic Croats, the Protestant Serbs, and the Muslim Kosovars are segregated into separate schools where they're taught different language, different religion, so on and so forth. And the point is, these are all epiphenomenon, right? These life expectancy is the byproduct of segregation. And so, segregation is really about resources and hoarding resources. And in the United States, there's two forms of segregation. There's like Jim Crow segregation, where you mandate segregation by law. But Jim Crow segregation was not actually mandated in terms of housing. It was public accommodations. It was where people could eat, where they could sit on buses, on trains, and so on and so forth. And again, there's lots of examples of it in the United States context. But the important point is that it's actually about hoarding resources. And that really what we mean by segregation isn't the separation of people per se, but it's the sorting of people into structurally unequal places. And so you have places that have lots of jobs, great schools, lots of infrastructure and supports, and places that are really definanced, underfunded, like Flint, Michigan is kind of the epitome of this, right? Where you not only does it not have an adequate fiscal base and high levels of poverty, but to save money, they actually poison the community. So I can talk about that more later. Citizenship is also a mechanism of othering. Who you extend citizenship to or who you deny it. And so in the United States context, the most famous example is the infamous Dred Scott decision, where they said, the United States Supreme Court said that even if they were citizens in the state in which they lived, persons of African descent could not become United States citizens. And so the 14th Amendment was enacted to overturn that decision. But you find examples of this all over the world. In Assam province in India and also in Myanmar, there are these efforts to purge Muslims from citizenship. In the last 30 years, there have been these various laws passed to do that. And so the most recent example of this is in India, where they published this national register of citizens that left 4 million people off. And if you're not a citizen, you lose all these benefits, right? Not just the ability to legal rights, but pragmatic, practical things like getting an ID card or so on and so forth. So these are in Saudi, and I have talked about this a lot. We also wrote about this in the Inclusiveness Index. And then there are narratives that deny, right? The denialism is a narrative that is a mechanism of othering. Just a contemporary example of denialism is really interesting. So the story about San Francisco and Osaka, Japan, where London Breed, the mayor of London Breed, say, this issue about the degree to which memorials and monuments recognize or deny past, not just atrocities, but past policies that engender marginality or not. And yeah, so there's lots of examples of denialism. So let me pivot now to just do a time check. Pivot to belonging. The answer to othering and marginality and group-based marginality writ large can't just be saming, meaning let's just treat everyone the same, let's enact anti-discrimination measures and call it a day. Rather, we actually have to take affirmative steps to figure out how to create inclusivity and really go beyond inclusivity. So not belonging has consequences. I don't know if any of you saw this, but so here's a lot of examples, right? Permit Patty, Bake Sale Betty, these are kind of, this black student at Yale was napping and a white student called the police, or these two black men who were arrested at Starbucks. But more recent examples, there was a young Asian woman who was being yelled at by a white woman who said, "You don't belong here, go home." You know, there are lots of ways in which people. There was an article in the New York Times this morning about immigrants in Germany. It says that Germany, one of the more progressive, you know, countries in Western Europe in terms of asylum, has created what one newspaper called alienation and making immigrants feel like they're strangers, right, in the country. And so that sense of alienation isn't quite strong enough word, but that feeling of being a stranger, right, is in some ways the feeling of not belonging. So what is belonging? I thought this was an animated slide, so sorry about that. So exclusion in this image is you have, let's say, an institution in which people who are not in the gray circles are excluded. So just to make this a really simple example, suppose this is a university admissions, right? And then this university has decided we're not going to admit non-white people, right? And then you go to inclusion where you actually admit non-white people, but the institution is fundamentally the same, right? You're admitting people of color, but you are not necessarily changing anything about the institution, about its norms, its culture, its curriculum, its pedagogy, the arrangement of power. So belonging is quite different. Belonging implies not just including people, and I would say, by the way, that this middle circle of construction of inclusion is actually segregation, right? You're including people, but you're segregating them within the institution. Belonging is a reconstruction of our institution, a kind of co-creation, co-constitution. That's why the image is blown up into a very different configuration. And so the challenge is, how do we move from inclusion to belonging? And so here are some differences, right? Actually, let me give you a specific example. So there was a book that came out last year about the integration of women into Yale University. And the book said that even though women were admitted, they were admitted in small numbers to begin with. In number one, they were admitted into the classrooms, but they weren't admitted into the social dynamics and power. And so the campus pub restaurant didn't allow women in. The social clubs didn't allow women in. The kind of senior positions on leadership on campus didn't allow women in. So that is integration without belonging. I'm not even, you could call it integration, but it's functional inclusion, but it's not really full integration, full belonging. And so here are some kind of differences between inclusion and belonging. Belonging is when, the group or the institution is reorganized, and you listen and accommodate all perspectives, and you strive to make everyone feel not just that they are welcome, but that they have a fundamental say and a stake in the institution itself. And so what are some characteristics of belonging? This is the book by Christine Wong Yap, our first artist in residence. She came up with like 20 some characteristics of belonging in her research, and it's a phenomenal little book. And these are some words that came up for her out of her list. So I would say, what is the goal of social justice? What is it we're trying to build? John would say, and on behalf of the Institute, that the goal is a society in which everyone belongs. But I would say, in the alternative, our goal is to reduce intergroup disparities by improving absolute outcomes, or outcomes in absolute terms. But I think there is a difference between these two, right? too often we focus on, I would call, superficial things rather than really figuring out how do we attack inequality, group-based inequality. And so one of the things I like to do when I talk with groups, and I probably should have done it before presenting my answer, is what is our goal? What is it we're trying to fight for? And so as a staff, we had a discussion about this. And everyone had a different articulation of the goal. You know, John's goal is a society where everyone belongs, and I think an equally not necessarily equally, but at least something we should aspire. That's the ultimate aspiration, right? I think as a meso step, if we can tackle intergroup disparities, we will be a long way towards solving the goal or getting to where we want to be. But again, this goes back to the provocation that I had earlier. I don't think it's actually possible to reduce intergroup disparities when you have homogeneous societies where almost, it's not universally true, but almost every country in the world has some degree of diversity. And of course, even if it's not diversity in terms of race or ethnicity or religion, you have diversity on sexual orientation, ability to disability, you know, and other grounds as well, gender. And so I think that's really the challenge that we face, is that we have this tremendous push right now coming from many different directions to build homogeneous communities. And I don't think it's possible to build a world of belonging or to reduce group disparities in segregated societies. So I'll stop there and look forward to your thoughts and conversation from this.
Thank you so much, Stephen. This is very decent, healthy food for thoughts. So we will open it with common conversational ideas or questions to Stephen. So please take advantage and raise your hand, and I will call on you. I guess, okay, I will give you some times, but I have a question for you, Stephen. So this idea of marching toward belonging, I totally agree, is it could be a utopian idea, and our struggle toward that goal will make our society just better. So what is the fundamental steps that you think is we need to take in the United States in order to reduce intergroup disparity? So when the larger chunk of sector that could permeate and allow us, as we say, if I don't know you, I will definitely have biases against you.
That's too big of a question for me to answer. It's a huge question. I'll, without being comprehensive, I think I'll mention a couple of things. So one is, we can't actually begin to reduce intergroup disparities unless we understand what's causing intergroup disparities. And so let's just talk about race for a moment. Right? There's been a lot of conversation around attacking structural racism and systemic racism. But the truth of the matter is that most of the solutions that are being proposed won't have much of an effect. Because if we're just, first of all, systemic racism doesn't just mean that inequality or racialized outcomes are within a single system, but actually the interaction and overlaying of systems. And so you have to figure out what are the generating and perpetuating and propagating racial inequality. And one of those things is the racial wealth gap, right? And so I think one of the challenges that we face, John said this on a staff call the other day, is that one of the things that we could do is if we could attack the racial wealth gap, then I think we could begin to bend down and reduce racial disparities in other domains of life, in housing and employment and educational attainment. One of the challenges, though, is that so in Ibram Kendi's book, Ibram Kendi is a really supple thinker. I'll stop right after this note. Ibram Kendi's book, he wrote this book, Stand from the Beginning. It's the history of racist ideas. And he says that the goal should be, which I agree with, which is to reduce racial disparities. But he explains racial disparities entirely in terms of discrimination. So he has these frameworks where he says, and I won't get into them unless folks want me to get into them, But he believes that discrimination is the core cause of racial inequality. I do not believe that. I believe that racial discrimination is prevalent, but based upon my study of the empirical research, racial discrimination is not actually prevalent enough or widespread enough to explain the enormous racial inequalities that exist in every facet of American life, such that actually it's structured and systemic, so that if you actually wiped out discrimination today, racial inequality would still continue because it's built into our systems and structures in a way that actually doesn't depend on individual racist actors or discrimination. And so I think you have to understand what the root causes are. And there's some really interesting social science experiments that try and distinguish, and I can share what those are, between discrimination and structural inequality. The last point I said, that would be my last point, but the last point is that we have to build institutions that foment belonging. And some of that we talked about in the article, and I can talk more about that later. But part of it has to do with institution building or re-engineering institutions or rethinking their relationships.
Thank you, Stephen. The floor is yours, fellows. Go ahead, Maria.
Hi, Stephen. How are you?
Hi there. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Thank you so much for your conversation. I had three ideas that I want to share. The first one is that when you talk about the IIT test, you said that the most prominent one was the one about skin tones because of race things. But actually, skin tones and race tests are two different tests. And that's interesting. And I wanted to link that to the conversation that we had previously around like racial formation with Michael Omi, with this idea that skin tones does not necessarily match race, which I think is interesting. So that was just a comment. The other point that I wanted to make is when you talk about discrimination and how it trespasses boundaries, like national boundaries. In the article, the Atlantic article that we read about how Minneapolis is geographically segregated, there was one paragraph which was exactly the same as something that was said by the mayor of a municipality in Chile. And it was this paragraph about how a lot of the protests had targeted a road that cut in half a community, just like ignoring the community and so on. And it was so shocking for me to read, because the parallel is just, I couldn't avoid sending the paragraph to this mayor in Chile, because it's just, we're so far away, and then the parallels were just so clear about how inequality works. And then my third point, and this is a question, is I want to do a disclaimer here. I always try to think. I always try to think of how like somebody who doesn't agree with what we are talking would kind of answer or would argue. And one of the biggest arguments, I guess, like against belonging is from people, and like these are close friends of mine that I'm talking about, like people that I interact with on purpose, because I don't want to be inside a bubble and be surrounded by people that think very much like I think. So don't judge me of being xenophobic, but I'm just quoting other people. But one of the biggest pushbacks against belonging is this idea of like, why do I have to accept and why do I have to enjoy the changes of structures if I like the structures that I have in place? And in some areas such as when the structures are being racist or perpetuating inequality, it's easy to argue against that idea that we have to change the structures because they are racist and they perpetuate inequality. But there are other areas which may be more related to values or to like cultural norms, where it's harder to I don't know, to defend the idea of changing a context in order to make everybody belong. And I have a very small example here. It is personal, and I'm not making generalizations based on this. But we were with my husband in Russia, and we wanted to see Lenin's mausoleum. I don't know how you say that in English.
Yeah.
And we were just walking around, and we hear people speaking Spanish. So we always approach to talk, especially in those contexts. So it was two people from Argentina, and we asked them like, "What have you been doing?" And we want to go and see Lenin. Like, have you been there? And they told us, "Yeah, we were there yesterday, and actually." It's going to close in 5 minutes, and you are like 15 minutes away from the place walking. But don't worry, because we were there yesterday and we were also late, and we offer money to the officers that had these huge bazookas and they offer money to these officers, and they could just go into, even though they were late. And then with my husband, we thought like, it would never occur to me to do that. I mean, I would just be so scared to do something like that. But I have also been in Brazil, and I have experienced the same thing of people offering money to police officers, and nothing happens. And in Chile, you would get arrested if you do that. And so in this imaginary situation, like, how do you respond to people in Chile saying like, we don't want immigrants that are used to corruption, because in Chile, institutions are very well respected. And so they have that rhetoric against immigration based on corrupt situations that happen in other countries. Sorry, that was so long. I won't speak.
No, it's interesting. Wonderful, wonderful story. So just taking the comments and questions in reverse order, the challenge that I think we face is that disestablishing systemic inequality, whether it's structural racism or any form of inequality, requires giving up some of our power, privileges, and prerogatives, right? So the fundamental heart of racial inequality in America is not actually policing. It's actually neighborhood stratification and municipal inequality. It's the financing of some places that are well financed, well supported, well built, and other places that aren't, like Flint, right? And you can see that all across the Bay Area, that where people live are, where there are good schools, access to green space, and where there aren't, where there's, there's environmental contamination, and that's the fundamental problem. And so, unfortunately, there is a certain portion of America, maybe 20% of America, according to Richard Reeves at Brookings, that benefits from this system, like the upper middle class that benefits from this resource hoarding, and so that happens at every level, right? It matriculates all the way from pre-K to higher ed to employment and jobs, and internships to career. And attacking that is going to require giving up a lot of the privilege. It's not about the epiphenomenon, right? It's about getting at these very deep structural forces, that these different geographic scales. The second point, I think, is a beautiful point, because it's an example that, at least as Americans, we can be incredibly parochial, right? We think that this stuff only happens in the United States and we only can see it through one lens. But the truth of the matter is that all of these mechanisms I went through, violence, segregation, denialism, discrimination, they occur everywhere, right? And so you can take an example, and it's those examples have occurred in many other countries and many other contexts. And it's only once we see those examples in other contexts that we realize that they're a mechanism and not simply an idiosyncrasy of the United States. So I'll give you an example. Think about the banlieues in Paris, right? In Paris, you have essentially, the African population, either immigrants or second and third generation, African French persons living in these kind of exurban fringe in the banlieues, right, the suburbs of Paris. And that arrangement is like basically the wealthy live in the core, and the poor and marginalized live in the periphery, where they're, don't have access to good jobs and good schools, and and so it's that arrangement actually is everywhere except the United States, which had this reverse pattern. And so across inequality, across the world, you can see these functional equivalents everywhere. That's why I showed that the map of Northern Ireland, because I wanted people to assume this is some racial segregation, and I wanted them to see, actually, I could show you a map of almost any place around the world, and you would see some form of segregation. I could show you maps of India or South Africa or the Philippines, and you could see these cleavages that really are profound, and they show up, and segregation correlates then with educational provision and employment opportunities, and so on. And your first point, that was just 100% a mistake on my part. I was looking at the IAT list, and I didn't see the race one there, so I momentarily assumed the two were the same, but I didn't think they were. I just misstated reality. So thank you for that correction. But I think that's partly the value of the othering framework, is that it's a frame by which we can see how all of these expressions of inequality have similar bases, right? Have underlying similar mechanics, and they allow us to zoom out. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't profound differences, right? It's hard to segregate by gender and sex, at least residentially. Very hard. Easier to segregate by gender and sex in terms of education or employment opportunities. Hard to do that residentially. So it doesn't mean there aren't differences, right? And that certain broad forms of discrimination against particular groups don't have unique expressions or unique features, but there are also these core underlying features. I'm sure that lots of folks have other questions, and I want to make sure they have time to raise them. And by the way, if you hate everything I said and you totally disagree with, that's okay too. John's articulation of belonging doesn't mean everyone at the Institute totally agrees with that vision of belonging. Or that the goal even should be to reduce intergroup disparities.
Okay, all right. So the floor for Gabriela, and after that, Sabrina.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you for your talk. I mean, I have two ideas in mind, but I'm gonna go for one. So, yeah, I was just thinking how to say to the oppressed, like, don't worry, trust the system, we're gonna change everything. Because what I feel is that if it's difficult for the people who belong, to transform that system, what I feel is that there is a huge disappointment and distrust of that if something can actually change. So yeah, like how to say if like your experience, not of just yourself, but your whole family and generations after generations, but nothing changed. I'm asking that because like I'm working in the cultural strategy project related to get out to vote campaigns. So if I was in Colombia, I know that the people will say, okay, I can vote, but how much money do you have? Because I prefer, to sell you my vote now, and I get something out of it, that just wait for someone to actually do their job. I'm talking that about Colombia, but I know that here it's very difficult to actually say to the people, no, go and vote. If you vote right, I'm sure there's going to be change. So, so yeah, I don't know if it's clear, this question. Maybe it's too.
it's very clear. It's an incredibly tough question and incredibly fraught, because to create real belonging, as I said in response to Sadiq's question, we have to rebuild institutions. We have to not just rebuild existing ones, but create entirely new ones. Because that's why I showed that image, right, of exclusion, inclusion, and then belonging. Belonging, you can't just admit people into a space, maintain the same power dynamics, and say that's belonging. That's not belonging. At best, that's some sort of minimal form of inclusion. So I think the challenge is how do we rebuild our society in a way that's more just, more equitable, more right? And it can't just be right. It can't just be and there are transformations that can occur in different ways. Like the New Deal was a transformation. It was not a fully inclusive one, but it was a transformation. It doesn't require revolution necessarily to rebuild institutions or create new ones. We are constantly creating new. I'll give you an example of a new set of institutions I think move significantly towards belonging, and that's the European Union. The European Union sought a new form of belonging, and so if you ask Europeans of a certain age, do they feel like they belong more to their nation state or to the EU? Many of them will say, especially millennials, that the EU identity is more salient than, say, the German identity. Another example of creating new institutions was during the Codesa period, after the end of apartheid. Mandela, it doesn't mean it's perfect, doesn't mean it's right, but we can recreate and build new institutions. Now, the hard part of your question is, can we do that outside of current electoral politics, right? That's the challenge. And I don't know the answer to that. I think it's very difficult, because the point of electoral politics is to control the levers of power and policy and institution building. And so unless you capture those levers and then leverage them into the rebuilding project, it's really hard. It's hard to create centers of power that can actually effectuate policy change in the absence of capturing those institutions. And those institutions are designed to thwart their capture. So the Electoral College is a really powerful example of where, like, it's actually designed to insulate the power the way it is. Same with the Senate filibuster, right? It's designed to prevent change. But I don't think that John had this line at our Kerner conference a couple of years ago. He said, we haven't invented an alternative to government. In the last, whatever you want to call it, 500, we'll call it 5,000 years, right? We have government, and there's really not an alternative to government in terms of, so I think, you can re-envision government like the Codesta period, where you built a new kind of government and you basically create a constitutional convention, right? That's one approach. And that's, I think, what the EU did with a series of treaties, functionally the same. And you can go that way, or you can go capture the levers of power through electoral politics and then try and rebuild or create new institutions. But I don't really know if there's an alternative to either one of those. If there is, I would love to know what it is.
Thank you.
Yeah, we could argue about that.
You're mute, Sadiq. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, it could be a room for argument, how to capture level of powers. But I will give the floor to Sabrina.
Hi, thank you. When thinking about belonging as this goal towards not sameness, but working towards like better institutions, and it's more about structural change and not individual actors, I wanted to ask, like, to what degree you still think individual responsibility to like relearn and internalize new values works in the project of belonging? Because I think a lot of general conversations that people have about implicit bias testing is that somehow the results of these are pointing towards causes of racism or like what leads to oppression. And so, yeah, just is it possible for belonging to occur even if these biases still remain intact to some degree, or it takes longer for us to slowly move toward a society where we all automatically think more towards belonging and not towards categorization or exclusion?
Yeah, those are really good questions, and they're two tough questions. So let me reframe the questions just slightly. So I think the first question is about, to what extent should we advance the project or advance the social justice project towards the goal of belonging or reducing intergroup inequality through structural change versus, individual um, egalitarianism and so on. And the second is, what's the relationship between implicit bias and, let's say, prejudice and behavior and so on. And so the first, let's do the second one. The second one, the reason it's so challenging is because even if we explicitly adopt an egalitarian mindset, to say like, I'm for equality, I really truly believe that. What we find is that even people who believe that still have unconscious bias, because it's just the water we live in, it's the air we breathe, right? That we internalize through growing up these unconscious biases. And it's not just about groups and valences, it's about everything. It's about, you see an object that, a fruit that may be poisonous, we have the unconscious everything about it, or a snake that has a shape of a certain head, that we internalize these and we react quickly. And so they're stereotypes that allow us to navigate the world. And so Mazarine's point is that even if we were to become totally debiased in terms of our belief systems, we would still have internalized unconscious bias. And so that's the challenge, is that even if we can extirpate that, how do we debias ourselves at an unconscious level? And I don't think there's a lot of critiques, and I think valid critiques of implicit bias trainings, because you can't debias yourself implicitly from a training. That's ridiculous. It's like you can't give the police an implicit bias training test and expect them to not have those unconscious biases. They still exist. It takes much more effort than that. Mazarine, one of the examples that she gives, and her book is on our Kindle library, was a screensaver that she used. So it was through repetition over time. So she had a screensaver of groups that she believed were, in her mind, were not associated with a certain kind of thing. And through repetition and absorbing that over and over again, she found that her implicit bias scores gradually decreased. But the kind of like terse, finite testing that consultants come in and do, that does not work. It's totally ineffectual. And I think, so I don't really think that can change. The larger question though is about, so there was, I hinted at this, Richard Sander and Janu Kucheva and a couple other social scientists created an experiment. And the experiment they ran was, I think it was in, I forget, it might've been across the entire United States. And they tried to figure out, they broke the United States up into commuting zones and then into neighborhoods within commuting zones. And they tried to figure out what proportion of contemporary segregation is explained by discrimination and which part is explained by structural forces. And so they ran an experiment where they created like, I think it was 1,000 bins of neighborhoods. And what they did was they just randomly sorted people using census data into bins. And then they compared that random sorting based upon structural characteristics, by the way. So they said, you take individuals who can afford to move into certain neighborhoods and based on their incomes, and then you randomly sort them. And then you compare it to how people are actually distributed today. And the premise of the experiment is that that the difference between the random sorting based upon income and the level of measured segregation, between that and observed segregation, is actually discrimination. And based upon that experiment, discrimination only explained 1/3 of segregation today, which means that, well, I think that's probably correct, that the 2/3 of inequality is basically structural and 1/3 of it is prejudice, bias, and discrimination. And I would extend that beyond race. It's probably true of gender, probably true of sexual orientation, ability to disability, ethnicity, religion. If that ratio is true, that suggests that the most we could do is reduce intergroup inequality by 1/3 by, reducing bias and prejudice. And the rest of it is structured in society and how people are sorted. So, I mean, that's just one experiment, and it gives us a little bit of insight. So I think it really suggests severe limitations to the project of bringing people on board to, a new mindset whatever. Not saying I'm opposed to that at all. And that's just by the way, my personal opinion. I'm not speaking for the Institute at all. I'm just saying I think that there are real limits to that. I'll give you a couple examples. So the Kellogg Foundation had invested literally millions, tens of millions of dollars into this project of racial healing and racial reconciliation. And I just don't think raising awareness of individual really has any ultimate empirical effect on intergroup disparities. That even if we raised awareness of everyone in America, right, at most we would reduce inequality by a third, and you still have that hard 2/3 of inequality there. Yeah, thank you for the hard question. I don't know if that was persuasive, but that's at least my understanding. So,
thank you, Stephen. Let's get a couple of last questions. We are hour and 15 minutes into. Lindsay, did you raise your hand? Yes, go ahead, go for it.
Thank you. So one of the things I'm just still thinking about is the idea that we can make such distinctions even between like discrimination and then other sorts of forces. And I guess part of what I'm thinking about is some research that was done on discrimination for housing with realtors. And a lot of times, like, we think that this is what this client will like, and so that we're just going on that. Or what will make me money as far as like flipping neighborhoods where they're able to take advantage of, or they want to minimize integration because they know they'll be able to make more money up until a certain point, which was like 8% on average. And then if they are a part of the flipping of this neighborhood, of it being integrated, and they get in early enough on that, then they make money, right? And so it's like discrimination is very explicitly happening, even if their motivation isn't necessarily about anything other than money. But of course, capitalism and racial discrimination, of course, have a close relationship. But so I would love if you could mention anything about that. But really my question more so is like, what do you think is a good balance to strike as we're thinking about motivating progress? Because I think a lot of times what ends up being a barrier to even thinking about it is kind of this false sense of scarcity or fear mongering that is relied upon heavily. But then also, as you mentioned, I mean, it is a giving up of privilege that will, and that's important for seeing actual change. And I think that those are kind of, that there's a balance that needs to be struck there. So any comments you have on either of those?
Yeah, those are two additionally tough questions. You all are really getting to the nub of the matter, so I appreciate that. It also just makes it my role more challenging. Let me deal with your first question. So discrimination in law has a narrow definition, and discrimination actually, you know, the operational definition of discrimination comes out of law, and it comes out of our anti-discrimination statutes. And in that model, there are basically three parts. There's an individual actor who discriminates, there's the victim, and then there's the act. There's actually a fourth part, which is the state of mind. But the state of mind is, you know, it's not an element so much as it is a background element, I guess. And in that model, you know, a supervisor refuses to hire, or hiring manager refuses to hire a person because of their race or their religion or their gender, right? And that's their motivating factor for refusing to hire or to promote or to fire, right? Or whatever the case may be. And that's how the law in Title VII conceptualizes discrimination. Now, discrimination potentially extends to structure. In Title VII law, there's what's called disparate treatment and disparate impact. And disparate treatment is what I just described, where you have a discriminatory actor who acts a certain way, or could be an institution, right? It's like Berkeley refuses to admit a student because they're of Jewish ancestry, right? So that would be discrimination on the basis of religion or ethnicity. But the law also takes cognizance of what's called disparate impact. So you have a racially neutral or a gender neutral policy that has the same effect. The law actually can take cognizance of that. Now, there was a huge jurisprudential battle around that, and the Congress actually had to amend Title VII to extend to disparate impact because the court overturned Griggs. There's a lot of legal history here. But generally speaking, the interpretation of discrimination in terms of how it's used in public sense is restricted to that original model of interpersonal discrimination. Now, I put in the chat, so there have been 4 major housing studies sponsored by HUD to try, which use paired audit testing. And what they do is they take a white tester and a black tester, and they go to like, let's say, an open house, and they try and ask questions about the house, or they go to a real estate agent and ask to see a house. In 1977, HUD did the first one. It was called that, I forget what it was called, but then they did it again in 92 or 93, and they did it again in 2000, they did it again in 2012. So there have been 4 studies. And each of these studies, they've done literally thousands of tests. And each of the tests, they actually can measure discrimination in different kinds of ways. So it's not just refusal to show, but it might be what neighborhoods do they suggest, steering, I put into the chat a study that was done last year by Newsday, which is a major Long Island, what's like the 9th largest newspaper, regional newspaper in the country. And they only did like 90 tests, and they took an undercover camera and they found that real estate agents were steering people into certain kinds of neighborhoods, lots of nefarious behavior. It was only 90 tests, so it was nowhere near the statistical significance of the HDS 2012 study. But the general empirical social scientific consensus around the HDS 2012 study, the housing discrimination study sponsored by HUD, is that since 1977, discrimination has gone way down. Doesn't mean there still isn't, but that's the empirical consensus. So there's an economist named Stephen Ross who wrote a summary of this research, and he found that it's gone way down. Doesn't mean there still isn't discrimination, but the discrimination has changed in terms of the type of discrimination. So here's what I would say. I would say that I'm personally conflicted. I haven't quite resolved on whether I believe that all structural discrimination can be traced back to a discriminatory actor. I'm not sure. I think that you could take a situation where you bring people into a place, a theoretical, hypothetical community, and just segregate them enough that the initial starting conditions, even if they're roughly equal in terms of starting position, which is not the case in American society. Race does not have an equal starting position. But so we could take it outside of American society. Like, let's say you put Serbian Serbs and Croats into a new community and segregate them, but they have roughly equal initial starting conditions. I think if you just find intergroup inequalities, because there will be subtle differences in resource allocations, in opportunities, in social networks that will magnify over time. And so here's some challenges, right? And this is, to me, very, very important. If we believe that systemic and structural racism is merely a byproduct of past discrimination, right? It's just a byproduct of Jim Crow and slavery, and not a byproduct of new systems and structures, then why is structural racism worse today than in 1975 in many ways? Let me give you a couple examples. Mass incarceration did not exist in 1975. If you look at statistics around mass incarceration, the United States incarcerated in 1975 essentially the same as every other country on the planet. And it's much worse today. Why did the subprime mortgage crisis destroy Black wealth? The Black wealth today is worse than it was in 2000 in terms of the ratio of inequality. So in my opinion, things are getting worse, not better in general, in terms of systemic and structural racism. Another example, gentrification and displacement. I said earlier, segregation and structural inequality is living in structurally unequal places. Now, the structurally unequal places that African Americans in the North were pushed into in the 1950s and 60s were urban cores, where they were isolated from many jobs, social capital, good schools. I think that is actually a better position to be in, even though it's categorically worse than what whites enjoyed. It's a better position to be in than to be stuck in an far-flung or inner ring suburb like Ferguson. Like, so, because even if you don't have access to many of the critical resources like jobs, you're actually close to vitalizing institutions like public transit or city services, you know. But it's worse to be in the banlieue of France than it is to be in downtown San Francisco in the Tenderloin, you know, or West Oakland. So I think actually, if structural racism was primarily, well, primarily, but it was merely vestigial, then I don't think it would be getting worse. It would be getting slightly better over time. When in fact, according to my observations, I think structural racism is actually getting deeper and more intense as we move deeper into the 21st century, not worse. I mean, just one last figure on this. Net African American wealth is projected to be zero by 2050. That is much worse position than it was than today or in 2000, let's say 5. So I think we're on the wrong track entirely. And so I don't think it's entirely traceable to those. Now, if it is traceable, it's, you know, new systems and structures that are being built on older ones. And so, but the causality is really complicated. And so I mean by trace is it's not like dominoes, right? It's there's new policy interventions that, and this, your second question is absolutely right. I mean, we cannot disestablish structural racism unless we challenge the privileges and prerogatives that many predominantly, but not exclusively white communities enjoy. I mean, in the Bay Area, it's not just white. It's, you have a lot of Asian communities like in Cupertino or Palo Alto, the predominantly Asian. I can show you the maps on that. But it's this tranche of of zip codes that are in, like, you know, the wealthiest, the most affluent, that have the most educated residents, and so on and so forth.
If I may ask, or I guess not really even ask, but just a quick clarifying. I totally agree with you. I don't think that discrimination is like the source of the seed. I think this kind of aligns with like Bonilla Silva out of his
colorblind, yeah,
exactly. But I guess I view discrimination as inextricably linked, not the seed, but that it reifies the systemic racism that we see. And so when we're thinking about how we create new institutions and structures, how we build them to be equitable, etc., how do we do that without, I guess, dismantling or addressing discrimination? But thank you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just one of the things I'll say is that it's not like we don't have anti-discrimination laws.
Yeah.
I mean, we have enormous numbers of I mean, the Fair Housing Act, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, you know, the FIA in California. We have lots of anti-discrimination laws. We even now have source of income discrimination laws on the books. The problem, I think part of the challenge is two parts of it. One is just what should our emphasis be? Because if we emphasize discrimination to the exclusion of these structural forces, I think we'll miss the boat in terms of what's really propagating systemic inequality. But the other part of it is that, you know, there's lots more we can do. I think we can get better in enforcement, but the overall social scientific consensus appears to be that discrimination has declined significantly since the 70s. Even, let's say it's 1 million instances of housing discrimination a year. That's really a drop in the bucket in terms of explaining racial residential segregation.
This is really good conversation. Yeah, I know, it's good conversation. So we are almost there. So if any one of you have other question, please feel free to shoot it to Stephen, and I will allow one final question from those who didn't have the chance to speak. Also, if you feel like you have to jump top of the phone, please feel free. Okay, one. Come on, I know you have one. You sit on one. Brianna, go ahead.
I kind of have it's not really like a fully formed question. It was kind of like a thought. So I'm wondering, it seems like we've kind of turned from largely like discrimination to economics. I'm wondering how exactly you target that like portion of it, because I think that it's like, you know, discrimination is almost disguised as you know, now this like economic kind of characteristics. So I think I'm wondering more about that, and because that seems much harder, I think, to combat, especially like as Lindsay said, it's mainly just because of you know, like capitalist structure. So yeah, I don't exactly have a question, but I'm just wondering if you could talk a little more about that.
Yeah. Well, you've actually asked like the most classic question of all, which is it race or is it class? It's like it's you know, it's so here's what I want. This is a very nuanced answer. It's a very nuanced question because simply saying you're not talking about discrimination doesn't mean that we're talking about class structures either. So I'll give you an example. Since 1970 to 2010, racial segregation, residential segregation, has actually declined using the dissimilarity index from about 0.8 to about 0.59. So it's about, you know, it's declined, I don't know what you call it, by a third or maybe a fourth. Class segregation has actually increased significantly during that same time. So Sean Reardon finds that from 1970 to 2010, in 1970, most neighborhoods were middle-class neighborhoods. About 60% of neighborhoods were middle-class neighborhoods. And the remaining 40% were poor or affluent. Today, it's inverted. About 40% of neighborhoods are middle-class, and the rest are either poor or affluent. So you could say on the one hand, well, look, class segregation's gone up and racial segregation has gone down, but the truth of the matter is that racial residential segregation is still higher than class segregation. And affluent African Americans are more segregated than poor whites. That is, and they're also more likely to live in lower opportunity neighborhoods than poor whites. So clearly, this is not reducible to class. There is a racial dimension that cannot be reduced to class. So the kind of the question I think you're asking part of it is like, what do we do? Do we focus on race or do we focus on class? A shift away from racial discrimination does not mean a shift away from race. So it might mean that we focus on racial disparities, right? More than class disparities or in tangent with class disparities. But we recognize that the way that we reduce or address racial disparities isn't through a strictly class or a race neutral lens. That is, we have to develop race conscious policies to attack racial disparities. And many of those will be class based, like affordable or mixed income housing, but many more of them will be things like affirmative action, will be things like contracting and employment policies that create quotas or set asides. You know, so and those are not class based, right? Those traditional race conscious policies are not reducible in any way to class. I would just say that, like, from an ontological perspective, race and class actually are co-constitutive, meaning that our understanding of race and class is actually deeply intertwined. So for example, if I were to say to you, the working class, in the United States, there is like an assumption that the working class is white, the white working class. You know, that goes back actually to the postbellum period. It goes back to, there's a book called David Roediger, or the middle class, right? Middle class is coded white. And there's like, so there are different kind of valences that different kinds of class structures have in the United States. But I think fundamentally the question of how do we attack racial inequality has to begin with race conscious policies, not leading with class. I think if you eliminated, if you adopted a Bernie Sanders kind of policy agenda that was, you know, just really heavily class focused, you would probably you would have some progress towards reducing racial disparities, but you might actually make them worse. You might actually make racial disparities worse, because if you think about what a disparity is, if you improve the condition of, say, whites, like poor whites, you might actually widen the gap between the median white household and the median black household. So I don't think that we can actually resolve. The short answer, I should have just led with this, is you can't resolve racial disparities through race neutral policies. You have to be race conscious, because race has its own fundamental structure in American society. And yeah, and it's not reducible to class. That doesn't mean that class-based policies can't help, or attacking like aspects of the neoliberal, regime can't help, but it's not gonna get you. And in fact, like, think about the New Deal. The New Deal was like probably, one of the most broad-based attacks on, you know, to build on class inequality, to bring up, you know, the white working class most hardest hit, and it was phenomenally effective with the GI Bill, and you know the Wagner Act, and you know occupational safety laws, and you know all these things. But it actually widened the gap between whites and blacks, because by excluding, you know, so I just don't think that you can achieve. I've just said it already. You can't achieve racial equality through race-neutral policymaking. That's a great question.
I really need to ask a follow-up question.
Sure.
Okay,
Okay.
because I'm confused with the reading that we did for the a workshop that we didn't have about targeted universalism, and I understand that targeted universalism is like a colorblind policy.
Not the case.
No?
So target, we don't have time to get too much into it, but basically targeted universalism is you have universal goals, but targeted processes.
Mm-hmm.
So the goals are race neutral, but the processes, the the implementation strategies that you use to pursue targeted universalism have to be race conscious, or you will never actually get the target groups to the universal goal. So overall, target universalism is race conscious, but the step one, the framing of the universal goal, cannot be group specific. It has to be universal, which doesn't mean it's colorblind, but the goal has to be universal, not group specific. But the implementation strategies have to be group specific, or you'll never achieve the universal goal. So for example, if the goal is to get everyone health insurance, or let's say health care, first, like a universal health insurance policy isn't going to get everyone there, because there are gaps in access, you know, ability to get to the doctor, where you live. So you have to have targeted race conscious policies to achieve that goal. Like a very concrete example would be English language proficiency, right? You can't get there through the same strategy for everyone. You have to have targeted implementation strategies to do that. So ELL programs, you know, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So target universalism is, it looks superficially, may look superficially colorblind, but the goal is universal, but the implementation strategies have to be race conscious. They have to be targeted based on race in many cases. I mean, you might be using target universalism outside the United States or outside of a context in which race is salient.
I feel like a lot of the examples from the podcast that we listen, where John talks about targeted universalism, I don't know if it was on purpose examples that were not race conscious, but most of them were that way.
Yeah, I don't think I heard his podcast, so I'm not sure which one it was. But the primer has lots of other examples. I don't know if many of them are race conscious, but I think some of them are.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, okay. Sorry.
It's a good question.
Okay.
No, it's good. It's good observation, and yeah, I mean, one thing we have to emphasize at Othering and Belonging, that even the idea of colorblind, just if it enter into a conversation, that's maybe we need to re-examine what is being said, because one of our arguments, you just can't pursue colorblind policy. It's just completely deviating from the goal of social justice in the United States. And I know as somebody who lived in different societies, the same thing, you know, sometimes it's, race is not salient in other places like United States, but the experience of the United States is very profound in a way in which is influenced through its own mighty culture beyond United States borders. But yeah. I really enjoyed this conversation, and myself, I could stay if anybody have a questions, but the time is now, and I really appreciate Stephen and the time he devoted for this. But if any one of you have a burning question or burning comment, please, I'll count till 3. Okay, done. Eliza, do you have anything? No? Okay, because I saw you join us. Okay, thank you so much.